Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. Welcome to Abnormal Security's webinar on Abnormal's quarterly BEC report, Trends in Q1 2020. My name is Curtis Casella, and I'm a Senior Marketing Manager here at Abnormal. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Ken Liao. Ken is the VP of Cybersecurity Strategy here at Abnormal. His previous roles include Vice President of Marketing at Jask and Vice President of Product Marketing at Malwarebytes, where he drove the enterprise go-to-market strategy. He also spent nearly 8 years leading product marketing efforts at Proofpoint through its IPO and has had extensive experience working on security solutions in the field as a solutions architect with some of the world's largest organizations. Ken holds a BS in mechanical engineering from the University of California at Berkeley. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ken.
Thank you, Curtis. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are joining today from. And I sincerely hope that you all are doing well during this time. So we wanted to kick off a introduction to Abnormal's quarterly BEC reports. And we'll start with a kind of a look back in Q1 of 2020. So what we wanted to cover today was an introduction to this quarterly BEC report, which this is the inaugural version that we're going to be releasing in about a week, and something that we're going to continue to be reporting on in the upcoming quarters. We'll then take that retroactive view towards Q1 and some of the observations that we saw during this last quarter. There's an interesting case study that we can begin to surface that highlights a number of these observations. And of course, we'll also take a bit of a spotlight, a special look at COVID-19 and what that did to the threat landscape, because given the impact that it has across the email threats, we would be remiss without taking a deeper look at that phenomena by itself. So let's take a look at, well, why are we doing a BEC quarterly report? The FBI's IC3 crime report, as you can kind of see over the years here, has shown that the masses associated with BEC are just huge. In fact, the 2019 report, which just came out at the beginning of 2020, show that it is now more than 50% of all cybercrime related financial loss. And even the year before that, even though it was, quote unquote, only 47%, it was still the largest single reason for financial loss as it related to cybercrime. And yet, one of the interesting things about BEC is that there weren't a lot of resources that were talking about the types and the tactics that cyber criminals were taking as it related to BEC. We all knew it was a big problem, yet there were numbers of reports that you'll see about the state of malware that's on the market, ransomware that's on the market, but no one was really kind of taking a deeper look at all of the different types of BEC, the techniques that attackers were taking, which is what led us to starting to surface a lot of the things that we were finding as it relates to this unique type of attack. So with that, one thing that I'd like to highlight is the broader spectrum of email attacks more generally. And I start with what I consider the old school attacks. These were things that have been around since the early 2000s, if not earlier, really at the advent of email, where we had high volume of spam, and Viagra and Rolexes were the things that were being promoted through spam. And then we also had viruses as well. But they were very simplistic back then, more of an annoyance than truly a security threat. Then we evolved over the last maybe 10 years or so to these broader campaigns that truly did become a security issue. And this is what we see in the middle here, where you saw attackers really begin to launch campaigns that leverage malicious URLs, or leverage malicious attachments. And now you were starting to install remote access Trojans or financial Trojans. And then so now you really began to experience true security risks associated with these types of attacks. Now we've really kind of evolved, and over the last several years, as we saw with that FBI report and the statistics that have been reported, we've really moved to this modern type of attack, which is heavily socially engineered attacks. And there's a whole broad variety in which we would classify as what we call BEC, but they can take on everything from executive or employee impersonation to attacks from vendors, whether they be from impersonated vendors or compromised accounts within those vendors. And so we're going to take a closer look at these components and how attackers are starting to tweak and tune their techniques and the trends and observations that we saw over the last quarter. And we'll continue to monitor these as we move forward. So with that, we'll start to highlight just a few of the observations that we found in the upcoming report, which again will be released within the next week or so. And so this webinar will really surface a few of the key findings from that report. The first one is an acceleration in BEC attacks, which by itself is not actually that big of a surprise. So between Q4 of 2019 and Q1 of 2020, a 28% increase. And we saw the financial losses from 2018 to 2019, and I fully expect 2020 to have that same level and velocity of increase as we get to, through the end of the year. We'll probably see that BEC is an even greater percentage than it was last year. So why do we see these things continue to increase? Well, quite simply, I just say success begets success. It is the biggest source of cybercrime related, I'm going to call it revenue, right? So if you're an attacker, this is a very fruitful way to make money. And if that is working and it's succeeding, it only makes sense that you're going to continue to double your efforts using this technique. Some of the other things that factor into this kind of continued investment is the fact that there are no expensive exploit kits that need to be purchased in order to execute a BEC attack, where you don't have to go invest in a malware or malware distribution systems in order to do this. And so the upfront investment is much less on these specialized tools. And your investment now is, I got to do the research to perform the socially engineered attack. You also, when you buy one of these expensive kits, you want to make sure that you're protecting them, right? You don't want them to be discovered and then ultimately they become easy to detect. And so we eliminate that risk of these EKs and the malware is actually being detected by sandboxing systems and things like that. And so there's actually less risk in terms of the financial exposure and investment needed to go launch these types of attacks. And then thirdly here, with BEC, the return on that investment is much more straightforward. So if you're successful in launching a BEC attack, right, it's a payroll fraud, or it's an invoice fraud, or it's a gift card fraud, but you're getting money very quickly and directly from the people that you're attacking. Now, if you compare that to other types of cybercrime where you're trying to steal records or you're trying to breach to get intellectual property, once you have that, you haven't won yet, right? Like as a cyber criminal or as an attacker, you haven't gotten your payment yet. You still have to go take those records or do that IP and sell it to someone. And so you eliminate that need to monetize those specific stolen records or intellectual property. So all of these things really factor into why BEC has become, one, not only popular and successful, but why we're going to see continued evolution and investment from the attackers in this particular vein, which is why I have, I predict that in 2020, we're going to continue to see a rise in both the number of attacks, right? We're seeing that already, as well as a number and amount of losses. A corollary to this is a emergence and growth of what I call BEC campaigns. And I put campaigns in quotes here because these campaigns aren't the types of campaigns that we saw when we were experiencing phishing campaigns, of the yesteryear. Those campaigns numbered in tens and 20, 40,000 messages that were getting sent. And that is certainly not the case when we talk about campaigns here. When we talk about campaigns in the spirit of these BEC campaigns, these are still very highly targeted operations. What we're finding, though, is that we're finding attackers that have a attack that can be leveraged across multiple targets. Or conversely, we have an attack that is targeting multiple recipients at the same target. And I'll dive into that in a little bit. But we're starting to see a pretty significant increase between Q4 of 2019 into Q1 of 2020. So I mentioned a 28% increase in terms of volume in the previous slide. Just in campaigns, in the first 2 months of Q1, we saw a 30% increase in these kind of campaign style BEC attacks. Now, then subsequently in March, we had COVID-19 hit, at least in the continental United States. And we saw a really big shift in March as a result of that. But you can clearly see, like, until that point, we were really starting to see a pretty significant increase in these campaigns. Now, as I mentioned, why would someone go and launch kind of the campaign style attacks with BEC? Well, the first one is that if I create an attack and I can begin to leverage that attack across a number of more targets, I can increase my conversion rate, right? Not all of these things are 100% successful. They do have a high success rate, but if I can go and attack 5 targets versus 1, then my chances of success go up without significantly increasing my risk of being discovered. A very good example of this is if third-party risk or vendor compromise, which leads to invoice fraud. If I go and pretend to be a vendor, well, that vendor has multiple customers that they work with. And so if I'm going to go, if I'm going to impersonate or compromise a vendor and use that as the basis of my BEC attack, I don't have to attack just one customer. I can attack 5 or 10 customers because they all are still used to me being that specific vendor. And so if I go to create a specific type of attack, leveraging that pretext, I can attack more than one target. Doesn't mean I can go attack 10,000 people, but I can certainly attack 5 or 10 and still be quite a targeted type of attack. The second variation of this around campaigns is attacks that are sent to multiple related parties as a way to increase social proof. So rather than a one-to-one communication, we will see a email going to a number of people, and then using that kind of broader sort of set of recipients as a way to increase social proof. So we see that shift in BEC campaigns. We saw the increase in the total volume of BEC attacks. The second observation that we want to talk about here is a shift in the targets with BEC. So it helps here to take a bit of a step back and look at BEC kind of in its early stages. If you remember back to that first chart that we showed, BEC was being tracked since about 2016, and we kind of saw this doubling year over year over year. Well, in those early days of BEC, they were very much targeting the executives, the C-suite. And there's a fairly high profile, you can go find this yourself as well. In 2016, there was a Fortune 500 manufacturer that was scammed out of $3 million. So a little bit of kind of the context setting here, a new CEO had just taken over at this particular organization. And within that same month, there was a request for a $3 million vendor payment that was actually wired. So what happened in this scenario here? The attackers researched how the company operates regarding payments. So they did have some information around, what approvals were needed in order for this to occur. They mined social media, so they understood the names of the key individuals, as well as as high profile a role as a new CEO. That's just plain business media, right? You don't need to do a whole lot of work to identify CEOs of large public companies like this. And then they also had compromised corporate email. So they understood what the request needed to look like when this request was sent. Now, in this particular case, again, new CEO had taken over. A BEC attack was then sent to a very, very senior level financial executive in this organization. Because these were very new relationships, right? That the CEO had just started. You can understand the pressure or the desire to impress your new boss. And so the payment was expedited very, very, very quickly. Now, in this particular case, there was a follow-on verbal conversation where the finance executive mentioned to the CEO, I'd taken care of that payment, and the CEO had no idea what was going on, right? Like, I didn't request that. So they made contact with the authorities, who basically told them, you're kind of out of luck, that the wire's gone. It's out of your hands at this point. But they happened to get very lucky because the bank account happened to be overseas. That happened to be a bank holiday. So it actually delayed the attackers being able to receive their payment, and they actually were able to retrieve and stop that money from getting into the wrong hands. So they got very, very lucky. But the point of this one is the former approach was really to target the C-suite. We're starting to really see in the recent years, and especially even over the recent months, a dramatic shift towards what BEC is targeting. And finance departments more broadly are, and maybe even somewhat obviously, a very heavy target for BEC attackers. They have that right, what I would call privileged access from a business user perspective. So C-suite declining, and that continues to be on the decline, 37% decline from 2019 to 2020. Conversely, a massive increase in finance employees getting targeted in that same time frame. So why? Well, one, there's potentially significantly more targets at the finance employee level, right? There's only so many executives that you can target. And so if I want to, kind of increase my odds of succeeding, as well as increase my possible targets, then going a little bit lower in the organization is the right approach. Finance employees, as I mentioned, represent this concept that I call a privileged business users. Like, we in security have this idea of privileged users in IT and security. Well, finance is that privileged business users. They have the power and authority to initiate a number of these financial transactions, which ultimately are what the attackers are after. And it's also, if you attack a employee that is commonly dealing with things like invoices, as an example, well, then it becomes much easier to slip another invoice in there, which is fraudulent. They're dealing with hundreds of invoices on a monthly basis, if not more. And the ability to kind of sneak one in there is just much easier when you're targeting people where their day-to-day job is really focused on this. So with that, what brings us up to another observation as well, which is very related, is a significant increase actually in invoice fraud attacks. So before we kind of get into that, we'll take a step back and we talk a little bit about, what's the broader approach that attackers take when they look at BEC style attacks. Well, it really starts with the idea of pretext. With any kind of socially engineered attack, you're pretending to be someone, whether that be a brand, whether that be an internal employee or an external vendor. Well, with invoice fraud attacks, it's generally coming from a vendor. That's who's going to send the invoice to you. Although occasionally you'll also find invoice fraud attacks which initiate from an internal employee, where the pretext is from an internal employee saying, hey, can you please pay this invoice? Now, once we have that pretext, whether we're going to pretend to be a partner, vendor, or employee, we then have to launch the attack itself. Now, this is a couple of different approaches here. One is you basically perform an impersonation where you spoof or use a lookalike domain, or in some cases, you actually see compromised accounts being leveraged for the same purpose, right? So you can either fake it or you can actually compromise. And then we actually launch the attack itself. Most of these attacks are just don't really contain any kind of attachments or URLs. We talked about that earlier as payloadless type of attacks. Although sometimes, we do have the invoice itself, which is an attachment, but I put this kind of in dotted lines because when we generally think about malicious attachments, we think about things that have malware associated with it. In this case, we have a invoice, which is an attachment, but it's not malicious in nature in that there is no weaponized attachment that's in play here. So as I mentioned, pretty significant increase in the number of invoice fraud attacks. And you can kind of see the dates going across the bottom there, but really significant increase in invoice fraud attacks. Couple of reasons why here. Invoices are pretty commonly exchanged on email. So this is, you expect invoices to come in through email. And so yet another invoice coming in through email doesn't really raise much suspicion. And also business invoices can represent very, very high values. One of the other types of BEC that we've seen historically in the past are things like paycheck fraud, where you pretend to be an employee and you get someone to change their direct deposit information. But for the vast majority of employees, how much are you really gaining by gaining one or two paychecks, right? Like even a very high paid employee is still not going to be equivalent in value to a very high value business invoice. And we'll actually walk through that in one of the case studies that's coming up here. So I think that's really one of the reasons why is the ability to hide these invoices, amongst all the other invoices that are coming in through email, and the relatively high transactional value associated with being successful here really can reap big rewards for the attacker. So what are the sort of broad observations and takeaways here? Really the acceleration in the size and scope of BEC attacks. We see that shift from C-suite to finance employees, and we see a dramatic increase in invoice fraud types of attacks. So with that, I was able to find a really, really interesting case study, which is an invoice fraud via vendor impersonation that almost highlights all three of these in kind of one example. So I thought it would be worthwhile to walk through this one. This is an invoice fraud via vendor impersonation. And in this particular case, and this has all been anonymized here, the attacker is targeting a telecommunications company. The vendor, which is being impersonated, is a real company, but in this case, it's being impersonated. And this attack takes place over the course of 2 months, where the attacker convinces the target to ultimately change banking details and redirect payment of what actually is a legitimate invoice into the attacker's account. And so the invoice that we're talking about here is over $700,000. So a couple interesting things to note here. It's a legitimate invoice. So the attacker never actually sent in a a fraudulent invoice. They basically were trying to redirect payment for a legitimate invoice to their account. And as I mentioned, why is invoice fraud so prevalent now? The amount in this invoice is over $700,000. So success here significantly more than, say, a paycheck fraud. So with supply chain types of attacks, we see kind of this whole broad spectrum of the supply chain, everything from vendor to you as the company, and then ultimately to customers. We actually see customer fraud as well, where products are being redirected into attackers, or criminals' hands, presumably for things like gray market sale or black market sale, for that matter. The more common one that we see, which gets directly to the dollars, is on the vendor side, because the company where you're at, you're going to pay your vendor dollars, and that's where the invoice fraud kind of comes in. So I won't go through this in a tremendous amount of detail, but there's various types of approaches. We talked a little bit earlier when I mentioned the kind of framework where you can have impersonation, you can have a compromise where the attacker actually leverages the compromised account to send to you as the target, or you see a hybrid. And the hybrid is you may start off using a compromised account, but then what you do is you fork the conversation into an impersonated account. The reason you may do this is the initial email that you get, you tend to scrutinize significantly more, right? That you're trying to see if you're getting, you have security awareness training. So you as emails come in, you all the things that you need to look for to make sure this is correct. But when you're ready to respond, and you actually do respond, the attacker at that point has engaged you. And so the next email that you get, you tend to have lower and lower sense of risk because you're now engaged. And so by forking the conversation, the compromised account, right, that the person who is unwittingly has their account being used at the vendor doesn't notice anything, because you don't have to hide that communication. And that's why you'll see attackers fork the conversation in this hybrid style attack. Now, in this case, this is a pretty simple impersonation attack. You saw that we kind of set the framework up above there. Now, what's also important here is the attacker personas. So the attacker, in this case, is Clara Cooper, fictitious person. So if you actually look them up on LinkedIn, even though the vendor's real, all of these people are not. And then what's interesting here is Clara, who is being impersonated by the attacker, actually has multiple people that are being impersonated also on the attacker side. And then on the target organization, as you'll see, a number of different characters, real people here on the right-hand side, that come into play. So when Carla sends this first email, she basically asks account payable for a EFT ACH transfer form. And she puts on CC Amanda, John, Dylan, and Chris. So now there's all these, so what's happening here is, rather than a one-to-one communication, we're starting to see other people on CC here who presumably work for, say, accounts receivable on the vendor side. And so it kind of provides a little bit of that social proof. The other thing here that you'll notice is that the request is very, I would say, low risk. I just want a form. I'm not asking you to change information. I'm not asking for anything sensitive in terms of information. I'm simply asking for you to send me a blank form, right? So it's a very low risk ask. And as someone who works in accounts payable, maybe I'm not so worried about sending them a form. Who cares, right? And so on February 4th, you notice the attack starts. Takes 10 days for accounts payable to respond, but responds with the form. Now, I won't go through the entire attack in detail here, but you'll see kind of a back and forth going back between the attacker as well as accounts payable. And you'll notice the first response comes from Megan. The second response now comes from Tiffany. The third response now comes from Ryan, right? And so by the time Tiffany gets to the email, she sees the back and forth with Megan. So automatically her suspicion is lowered. By the time Ryan gets to the email, Megan and Tiffany have responded, and so his suspicion is even further lowered. And so you can kind of see how this social proof and this engagement kind of picks up momentum, so to speak. So this is a follow-on conversation, a month and a half into the engagement here. And then you can kind of continue to see back and forth. Now Tina comes into play. And the final thing that I'll point out in here is that Tina basically updates the entries. So through this entire 2-month conversation, the target organization, the victims, actually are convinced that the new banking information needs to get updated, and it actually does occur. So, what are some of the key attributes of the attack? We have that domain impersonation, where you can replace I's with L's, very hard to tell. You can add an S, or you can add INT for international, or INC to the end of something. And it still looks very, very legitimate as a result. In this case, we talked a little bit earlier about the trend to these kind of campaigns. To add greater credibility, this threat actor here added 5 additional impersonated employees, and that provides a little bit of that social proof. And that initial ask is very low risk, right? We're just simply asking for a form, and then it picks up momentum over time. So very common attack that we're starting to see a pretty strong rise in, and highlights one, that we're seeing more and more of these attacks. They're very, very fruitful. We talked a little bit about these kind of campaigns that we're starting to see. You'll see that this one didn't engage with a C-level executives. We just simply dealt with accounts payable. All of those types of things are trends that we're continuing to see. And certainly this one, the attacker was very patient, took place over 2 months, and actually was successful before this was actually caught at the very, very last minute, before any payment was actually made. So with that, I'd like to transition just for a few minutes and talk about a unique spotlight on COVID-19. Again, this isn't unique to BEC, but I think it would be remiss to talk about any kind of email threat landscape in Q1 of 2020 without talking a little bit about COVID-19. So unsurprisingly, we saw a massive spike in COVID-related campaigns, particularly as we started to see all of the quarantine and shelter-in-place policies being put in place in mid-March. And so we definitely saw a little smattering in the early days of the year. And this was as COVID-19 was still primarily overseas. It hadn't hit the US yet. And then once it became news in the US, we certainly saw that acceleration and a massive spike. Now, the types of attacks, as I mentioned, this isn't unique to BEC. We certainly just saw a lot of spam more generally, and that's what the big purple line there represents. The next big one, the green lines, are credential phishing. So we saw a lot of credential phishing as the goal for some of these attacks during this period. Now, one of the more interesting things to correlate, and this is not going to be surprising, but you can actually map the themes with the news cycles. In February, we saw a lot of attacks where the theme of the attacks were impersonating CDC, providing information about active cases. This was still early breaking news at the time. And so people were very interested in understanding, is COVID-19 where I am? And so the theme there was very much around kind of this type of information, right? We wanted this type of information. They were praying, the attackers were really kind of praying for that desire for information and using that as the lure. Then in early March, we really saw the credential phishing attacks become mainstream. By late March, we were starting to see the financial impact, right? People, were starting to have quarantines, restaurants were closing down, a number of non-essential businesses were closing down. And so then you were starting to see the themes related to major financial institution offering financial breaks, right? Like, no more late payments from credit cards, things of that nature. That became the big theme. So again, you can clearly see a very close tie between news cycles and the overwhelming themes that we were starting to see. And then by April, a lot of the stimulus check attacks. So the big takeaway here, and again, this is probably not a big surprise, broad scale attacks are often going to leverage current events for relevancy. And this was probably one of the biggest sort of global events that we've had in recent history. And so that's why we saw such a dramatic swing towards these types of attacks in the Q1 and going into Q2. And a big part of it was the desire for information. We all wanted information. We as individuals desired that information. And so that really represented a major opportunity for cyber criminals. And then the sudden transition for remote work really magnified the email threat vector. Suddenly we weren't able to have those conversations in the office anymore. And so our kind of lifeline back to people that we work with, how we communicated more generally, it was really going to be through things like Zoom. It was going to be through things like email. It was going to be through things like Slack and Teams, right? And so email, by and large, is the primary communication mechanism. And so BEC already kind of in that particular threat vector really just magnified that as a risk to employees all around the world. So with that, I'm just going to take one quick slide and talk a little bit about who Abnormal Security is. We are a cloud email security platform, and we were really invented and designed to complement the native security controls that came with Office 365, whether it's EOP or ATP, or the native security controls that come with G Suite. We integrate via a native API to those email security platforms. So that provides very little risk in terms of integration, integrates in minutes. There's no MX record changes. That also means we can coexist with a secure email gateway if that already is in place or not. So we have plenty of customers that choose to keep their secure email gateway. We have another half of our customer base who has decided that they don't need that, and they leverage us simply to augment and complement the native controls on the email security platform or the email platform. The team really comes from a data science background. So a lot of the founding team came from Google and Amazon and Twitter and Pinterest, really kind of taking a data science approach, which allows us to identify the abnormalities in communication, which allow us to stop these socially engineered attacks. We've really kind of paired that up with a number of folks from security companies like Proofpoint and FireEye and Palo Alto. And really that's the makeup of the team here.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. Thank you so much, Ken.
Thank you, everyone.